Hello, welcome to this edition of Early Filmmaking in Jacksonville, Florida, a virtual event that's a collaborative effort between the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum in Jacksonville and the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum in Fremont, California. I'm Jim Kerkhoff with the Norman Studios. Today, we'll be delving into the history of the Eagle Film Company. The Eagle Film Company built what is known today as Norman Studios. Originally christened Eagle Film City, this is the only surviving silent motion picture production facility from Jacksonville's era as the winter film capital of the world. To help us examine this important facet of the city's film heritage, I'll be joined by two experts on the topic of the Eagle Film Company. Our first Eagle whiz kid is none other than film historian and author Steve Massa. Steve has authored quite a few books relating to silent film comedy. In fact, he's widely regarded as a walking encyclopedia on the subject. Steve is joined by his cohort in classic comedy crime, Mr. Ben Modell. In addition to heading up Undercrank Productions, which restores and distributes rare silent films, Ben is an incredibly talented motion picture accompanist. He frequently performs for screenings at the Library of Congress, Museum of Modern Art, American Film Institute, as well as in theaters around the country and even abroad. Both Steve and Ben are particularly well suited to explain about the Eagle Film Company and how it found its way to Jacksonville, Florida. That's because Steve is the author of Marcel Perez, the International Mirth Maker. Perez was Eagle's star comedian during the company's heyday in Florida. And Ben, through Undercrank Productions, has restored 5 surviving Marcel Perez shorts made at Eagle's Jacksonville studio during the mid-teens. All of these films are included on 2 Marcel Perez DVDs that Undercrank distributes, along with examples of the comedian's earlier and later work. So enough of my buildup. Now let's talk about the Eagle Film Company and the motion pictures it made here in Jacksonville. Steve, can you explain the company's origins and how it ended up in Florida?
Okay, well, the Eagle Film Manufacturing Company was formed in Chicago in the fall of 1915. And the idea was to build what they called the Eagle Film City in Arlington. So they gathered everybody together in Chicago. They hired all the actors in Chicago, and they set out in December, right before Christmas, for Jacksonville in a blizzard. There's a memoir by the wife of one of the performers who said they left in a blizzard. But of course, by the time they got to Jacksonville, it was 70 degrees. And the studio was still sort of being built to a certain extent, but they got there and they got started right away. And the idea was for Eagle Film City, they had 2 or 3 stages. They had, it was very well equipped. I mean, the kind of state of the art, where they had electricity, they had bungalows where some of the actors lived. But the key thing was they had their own developing plan, so they could develop the films themselves. They didn't have to send the rushes back to Chicago and back and forth. They could actually develop their films there. And in the ads, it looks like they were really thinking they were going to do their own productions, but they wanted to be used as a facility for other companies that were shooting in Jacksonville, especially because of the developing their own films. So that was like a key selling point. So they were open to bringing in, because there were a lot of studios shooting in Jacksonville at the time. There was Vim, there was Lubin. So they were hoping to tap into, other studios using them. And they got started right away. They announced 4 productions they were going to do. 2 were comedy shorts. There was a series that they were going to do called The Adventures of Duffy, which Duffy was a goofy cop. And then there was something called Grogan's Alley. And these were like 1 or 2 real comedies that they were going to make. But there were 2 features announced, something called Pirates of the Sky and also something called Ocean's Pearl. Now, as far as we can tell, they only started shooting on The Adventures of Duffy. The other items never were shot, but they did start shooting Duffy. There are production stills that exist with the people that they assembled, and they did shoot some of Adventures of Duffy. And then after a month or two, they kind of shut down, and then they reorganized. And that's when they brought Marcel Perez into it.
Steve, the Eagle Film Company is best remembered for producing 1 and 2 reel shorts featuring European comedian Marcel Perez. Can you talk about this performer's screen work overseas and what brought him to the U.S.?
Sure. As I mentioned, Eagle got to Jacksonville and they started producing, but they did stop, and then they reorganized and they brought in Perez. Now, Perez was an internationally known comedian. He was born, accounts vary, but he was Spanish and he may have been born in Barcelona. We don't know for sure, but he started appearing, he grew up in circuses and sort of European music halls. He was a clown. And he started appearing in films as early as 1900 in France. So he was making these early Pathé and Gaumont comedies. And he's been spotted in a few early comedies during the aughts. And in 1910, he was hired to do his own starring series for a company in Italy called the Ambrosio Film Company. And they starred him in his own one-reel comedies, and his character name was Robinette. And he did 5 years of these comedies, and they were very popular around the world, in the United States and in England, other English-speaking countries. He was known as Tweedledum. And he did 5 years of these, and he was very popular, and he wrote and directed them as well. He did these under a different name. The name he used there was Marcel Fabre. And Perez was a real character because he changed his name every time he went to a different company. But he was Marcel Fabre in Italy for the Ambrosio Company. But with the story is the outbreak of World War I made him decide to leave. He wanted to get out of Europe. So he came to the United States in 1915. The first place he worked was in California for Universal. He did a Joker comedy. That was one of their series, something called A Day at Midland Beach. He did that, but then he ends up in Florida for the Vim Company. And he did 4 films for Vim in 1915, where he was a character named Bungle. He did 4 of these. Unfortunately, none of them are known to exist, but Oliver Hardy was in them because he was part of the Vim Company. So he was at Vim, but then when Eagle reorganized in early 1916, they hired Perez and he became their star. And then he set about, writing and starring in these shorts. Some were 2 reels, some were 1 reels. 11 were made, and 6 exist today, although 2 of them aren't complete. One of them is just the first reel of 1, and another one is just clips. The ones that survive are A Busy Night, Lend Me Your Wife, and of course, we're going to show a couple of those this evening. But he made 11, and then Eagle sort of went out of business. Well, I think we'll talk about that in a minute.
Thanks, Steve. Now let's bring Ben Modell into the discussion, considering he's the one responsible for resurrecting the Perez Eagle shorts. Ben, Marcel Perez is not one of the more widely known silent film comedians. And until you restored some of his surviving films, the work he did had been out of circulation for close to a century. Can you explain how you first became interested in this obscure comedian?
Well, I first heard of and saw the films of Marcel Perez at the Museum of Modern Art I guess somewhere in the late aughts of the current century. Steve and I were going through the Museum of Modern Art's collection of rare comedy shorts, preparing for a series of shows we wound up calling Cruel and Unusual Comedy. And Steve had been raving about Perez. And when I got to see the films of Marcel Perez's that MoMA had, I was taken with them, with Perez's on-screen persona and his abilities as a comedy creator and director, and was a thorough fan instantly. And what was great was that when we included the Perez films in some of the programs that were presented to the public, our audiences had the same reaction. The comments we would get from people who attended the shows would say, how come I've never heard of this guy before? Who is this Marcel Perez? And they thoroughly enjoyed his work. So that was my first introduction, actually the first and then the second round of shows that we did at MoMA called Cruel and Unusual Comedy. I think the second one showcased films that we programmed that were sourced from the iFilm Museum in the Netherlands. And they have a lot of Perez's earlier Robinet comedies made for Ambrosio in Italy. And around this time, I had now done two home video releases done as Kickstarters. In 2012, I did my very first one. I think I was probably I was the first person to use Kickstarter to crowdfund from fans to help get rare films from an archive out to fans who want to see them again. I had now done Accidentally Preserved 1 and The Mishaps of Must You Suffer. And I was so taken with the Perez films, I wanted to do a DVD release crowdfunded by fans of Marcel Perez comedies. So what we wound up doing is we saw what was in the collection at the Library of Congress. I've been an accompanist at the Library of Congress since I think 2009. And as part of the Mishaps of Must You Suffer DVD project, I wound up working out with the Library of Congress a co-branding arrangement. So that made it palatable, or more so, for me to source films that were in the collection there. And there were enough films at the Library of Congress to fill up maybe half or a little more than half of a disc. But because of the work that Steve and I had done together with Ron Magliozzi from MoMA, with Elif Rangan-Kainacha from iFilm, we thought we should include some of the European shorts as well, and we worked that out. Well, the first Kickstarter I did for Marcel Perez was in the summer of 2014, and that volume, this one here, was released the following year in 2015. That's the one that won an award at the Cinema Ritrovato DVD Awards at their festival. And then a couple of years later, a few more Perez films had turned up, and there was enough for a second volume. And that got kickstarted in 2017 and released the following year. And it's been great to see the reaction from so many people who have no idea who this guy is and how much they're enjoying seeing his films.
So once you located these one-of-a-kind prints, what exactly was involved in the restoration process to bring them back to life?
Well, the films really just needed to be scanned. There was no budget to do any real, what we consider restoration work, stabilization and digital cleanup. That was not part of the process. But what we were really restoring was his reputation and just that people knew about him at all. And so the films that were at the Library of Congress were scanned in HD or 2K by the Library of Congress's Video Lab and their Film Lab, as well as I think for one or maybe it was the second volume, we were able to access a couple of films from the Museum of Modern Art. These also were sent from MoMA to the Library of Congress for scanning. So something like Some Hero is a print from MoMA, and I think Lend Me Your Wife is another one that MoMA has in 35 millimeter. So we were working with new digital scans of these 35 millimeter elements, and in some cases 16 millimeter, because some of these films only survive because they were made available in 16 millimeter for home use, for rentals. This is where my term accidentally preserved kind of comes from. So either format, but the wonderful thing about scanning in HD or 2K is that even a 16 millimeter print can look awfully good, as opposed to the standard def telescenes where you were just running something in real time that would have been done 15, 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So they looked awfully good. So we would get these scans, do some exposure correction. In some cases where a title was either missing or too short, we would extend it or freeze it, just so we would have that. Where there was missing footage, so the film Oh What a Day has a chunk missing in the middle of it, but Steve was able to find what those story elements were, and we were able to access a lobby card. I think Mark and Cole Johnson had it in their collection to put on screen to help bridge the sequence that was missing from the middle. And the only other thing that was really done was speed adjustment. So based on the research that I've done over many years about the speeds films were shot at and then shown in theaters, I determined whether something would be rendered out to emulate being projected at 20 frames per second or 21 frames per second. But it was in that range that seems authentic to me. Not just looking at it and thinking, oh, this looks too fast to me, or this looks too slow to me, but what speed was this shown at in theaters, and being also a speed that the people who made the film knew to expect. So their cranking and their movement got adjusted to accommodate something cranking from 16 or 14 and then shown at 20 or 21, not just whether it looks right to me. So basically that, I think there were a couple of instances where I created new title cards. I think it might have been Sweet Daddy, or where I created a new main title based on the credit title that follows it. What is often the case, especially with a very rare film like these, is that the heads and tails of the reels don't really survive, and there may be jumps or a title may be missing. And that's part of, it's not so much restoration as it is detective work. So the film Scrambled Honeymoon survived at the British Film Institute, but cataloged in a different way under the title Tweety. It's whatever it is. It was cataloged as whatever the first intertitle of the film was, because that's where the print begins. But once we looked at it, Steve was able to look it up and go, oh, this is A Scrambled Honeymoon. Little things like that. We would try to present the film close to how it might have been seen by creating titles and creating end titles and things like that.
Sounds like quite a bit of work, Ben. For those of you who've never seen a Marcel Perez comedy, especially one made here in Jacksonville, we're going to screen one of his Eagle comedies, compliments of Undercrank Productions and the Museum of Modern Art. It's titled Some Hero and was shot in quite a few areas around the city. In it, you'll see Jacksonville as it looked in 1916, along with part of the Eagle Film Studio itself, now known as the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum. So let's sit back and watch this early Jacksonville comedy with music by none other than Ben Modell. hope you enjoyed that little film. I have to say, the nonstop gags in Some Hero make it one of my favorite Perez shorts. And now, living in Jacksonville, I've started tracking down shooting locations for this and other films made here. For instance, I've been able to identify quite a few shooting sites for Some Hero with the help of Jacksonville historian Wayne Wood. So how about if I take you on a little tour? Remember the opening sequence that involved hoisting a safe to an office building's upper floor? Well, that was shot at the Duval Street side of the African American Masonic Temple. The building still stands and is located at 410 Broad Street, looking much as it did in 1916. At the time, it housed the Anderson Bank, which can be seen on one of its windows. It was the largest African American bank in the state of Florida at that particular moment in history. In this reaction shot from that same sequence, the church behind Perez is the B'nai Israel Jewish Synagogue at the corner of Duval and Jefferson Streets. Looking down Duval Street from the existing office building, you can see that the synagogue is no longer there. This aerial shot from the safe hoisting sequence was filmed using a downtown building on Hogan Street. That's the First Christian Church and St. James Building, now City Hall, off in the distance, looking north from Adams Street. Here's what that Hogan Street location looks like today. As you can see, a lot has changed. This scene between Perez and his comedy love interest, portrayed by his actual wife, Babette, was shot in Riverside Park. Here's a vintage postcard showing the park's small lily pond and its wooden bridge, where this scene was filmed. Although the larger duck pond survives, here's the area where the smaller lily pond and bridge were once located. And how about that thrilling chase sequence? Perez's pursuit of the bad guys started on Riverside Avenue. In this frame grab, we're looking southeast at Copeland Street. As you can see, some of the large houses seen along the roadway still stand, looking much as they did back in 1916. The shots of Perez on his bicycle pursuing the villains was also shot along Riverside Avenue. This is the corner he passed in the frame grab I just showed you. It's at Riverside Avenue and Osceola Street. In fact, it's the same corner where the Vim Company shot a sequence for The Serenade, featuring Babe Hardy and Billy Bletcher that very same year. Okay, so now here's the bridge our sneaky villains raced across during their getaway. The span was on St. John's Avenue, crossing over Fishweir Creek. This is how the bridge looks today. Quite a bit has changed. The lonely stretch of country road seen during the chase sequence is what's now Herschel Street. It's just south of Fishweir Creek and has definitely been built up over the past century. Oh, and remember the shot taken along that curving road with the small bridge? Here's that same road now. It's Lakeside Drive, and the scene was shot where it intersects Wabash Avenue. This may be more information than you want or need, but let's take a blow-by-blow look at how the overall chase sequence was filmed. The Eagle film crew began shooting along Riverside Avenue, as I mentioned. It then moved south to the Fishweir Creek Bridge, then onto Herschel Street just below that, and after that, traveled even further south to Lakeside Drive. But hey, we're not done yet. So what about the alleyway where the kidnappers ran into their hideout? Well, believe it or not, we now know that Jacksonville location. It's at the rear of the Richmond Hotel at 420 Broad Street, right next door to the African American Masonic Temple seen at the beginning of the film. The shot of Perez tumbling into a pool from his bike was shot at Eagle Film City. You can see the main production building just to the right. Although the studio pool was filled in at some point, here's what that same camera angle looks like today with the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum building on the right. And finally, here's a shot of Marcel and Babette at the conclusion of Some Hero. Based on the small building seen on the left, this was filmed along Westdale Drive, just on the other side of the studio's main production building. I have to tell you, after going over all that, I'm exhausted. So let me go back to Steve Massa and ask another question. Steve, there were several supporting comedians working on the Perez comedies at Eagle. Can you tell us about them? For instance, what did they do before Jacksonville, and where did they end up after leaving town?
Okay. Well, there were some, interesting supporting players, and a couple of them ended up in Hollywood films and, ended up in some famous films. The most famous were husband and wife, Louise Carver and Tom Murray. Now, they had come from vaudeville. I guess they were hired in Chicago like the rest of the Eagle performers. Louise Carver had appeared on Broadway with Lou Fields of Weber and Fields. She was in a show with him called The Henpecks, where she played his henpecking wife. So she was pretty well known. And Tom Murray, again, he was a comedian. He did blackface, of course, like most people did at the time. So they were all around performers. They were musical, they were comedy, and they were hired to be part of the Eagle ensemble. And they did until the studio closed. And then they did some other things that were going on in Jacksonville. Louise Carver turned up in one of the Victor Moore comedies that was being shot in Jacksonville, something called Ballads in Bologna, and Tom Murray. But they ended up in Hollywood by 1920. And Louise Carver got settled in at the Mack Sennett studio, and she became a regular foil, for comedians like Harry Langdon and these kind of meek comedians, because she was big and fierce looking. So she would play these tough. There's one where she smokes a cigar and she's got a big tattoo on her arm and stuff. So she became a very memorable character player. And Tom Murray, her husband, was also working. He was doing various shorts. He's in Buster Keaton's Cops. He plays the chief of police. He's in a few Keaton films, actually. He's in Sherlock Jr., but he ended up with leading roles. He's got a big role in Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. He plays Black Larson, who's the wanted criminal who's in the cabin that Max Swain and Charlie end up in. And he's also got a large role in the Harry Langdon feature, Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. He's Harry's rival in this foot race that they're doing. So he had some major roles. And at the end of the 20s, his performing career kind of dropped off in movies, but he started a group, a musical group called the Beverly Hillbillies. And they were really popular on the radio, and they played like country music, jug music and stuff. But they coined the phrase Beverly Hillbillies long before the television series in the 1960s. And Louise Carver kept working in sound. She continued to do a lot of comedy shorts. Tom Murray passed away in 1935, but Carver lived to be 87, passed away in 1959. So those are probably the most famous. There was another character player called Billy Slade, and he was a regular part of the Eagle ensemble. And he worked a lot, but he's as unknown today as he was at the time. He never became a well-known character player, but he worked with Marcel Perez in these Eagle comedies. He also worked at Vim. He worked with Oliver Hardy in some of the Plump and Runt films. He worked with Victor Moore, like Louise Carver. But then he and his family moved to the East, and Victor Moore had moved to the East. So he worked with Victor Moore there. Marcel Perez moved to the East. He worked with Marcel Perez in the late teens. And there was another comedian, Johnny and Emma Ray, and he had worked with them in Jacksonville. And again, he worked with them in the East Coast. So he kept working. Eventually, he became head of the property department at Fox Film Company, Fox Studio in New York. They were based in New York at that time in the early 20s. And then when they're going to move everything to California, he decided to stay on the East Coast, and he got out of the business at that point. There was one more performer who was very interesting. His name was Rex Adams. And I think he was originally hired to be the star comedian. He was Duffy in The Adventures of Duffy. And in the reorganization, Marcel Perez became the star, and Rex Adams played supporting roles in some of the first Tweedledum films. But then he leaves the company. I don't think he was happy about not being the star comedian anymore. And I don't really know what happened to him after that. I think he went back to Chicago, but the trail gets kind of cold. But there is an interesting coda to the Adventures of Duffy, which I'll tell you in a minute.
That's great information, Steve. Thanks. At this point, I'd like to get Ben back into the conversation. We're about to screen another Perez comedy made at Eagle Film City titled A Busy Night. In it, he plays multiple roles by using some extremely advanced special effects considering the time period. Can you offer us some background about the film, Ben?
A Busy Night is a remarkable film. First of all, it only survives in a 16 millimeter print at the Library of Congress. The multiple exposure technique is it's one that had been used a lot by filmmakers and comedians in Europe and in the US at that time. And if you've seen the movie Suspense by Lois Weber, there's that triptych. But there are Max Linder comedies where the same thing is being used around the same time or earlier. So the idea, and just as Georges Méliès about multiple exposures. So it had been used before, but what's remarkable about A Busy Night is the idea that, he'll play all the cast in the film. And this is, years before Buster Keaton makes The Playhouse. And what is really remarkable is the way Perez will be two of himself in a scene and then cross over against himself and go out the door or something. And it's almost seamless. And one of the things that Perez that I find remarkable about his work, and I don't see him using this a lot in the European films of his that I've seen, is both with dummy work and with the effect you see in A Busy Night, which is that he seems to know that the way to make those things work so there isn't a lurch when the dummy that's been dropped off a building turns into Perez and back. Or there's there's the film You're Next, where he winds up working at a movie studio. There's a gag where he falls off of a building, lands in the street, and a car runs over him, and then he gets up, and we go from Perez on the ground to the dummy and back, and it's to cut on the move. So one of the things I saw in watching A Busy Night, going frame by frame and trying to see where the edit is, because usually if you've ever watched sitcoms like I Dream of Jeannie or Bewitched, you can tell where there's a jump, but you really can't tell in a film like A Busy Night. And it's because instead of holding still, then stopping the camera, resuming, and then moving, he would, if say there's a Marcel Perez here and there's a Marcel Perez here, and this one has to cross over this way, he would start to turn, and then while he's moving, he cuts to the other actor in his clothing, so that his face isn't seen, crossing over himself. And he does it over and over and over in almost every single shot, and it happens so quickly you can't believe what you're seeing. But knowing to cut on the move, and it's the same thing with all the dummy work that you see in a film like You're Next. It's almost, unless you're really looking for the splice mark, you really don't see it. It's really remarkable. I mean, I don't know much about the production, but it's really mind-blowing that he's in the US for a year and he comes up with this idea that I don't think he's done it or done much of it before. It's an advanced thing to try. And one of the things as a comedian and a filmmaker that I find so impressive about Perez is that while, as Steve often talks about, Perez kept changing his name, changing his costume, I feel like he was also doing this because he was trying to fit in. He was trying to come up with a name or a character that would click with an American audience. His earliest films feel and smell a lot like keystone product in other studios, and it's not like there's a long learning curve of him trying to adapt what he was doing as Robinet in Italy for American audiences, the way that Linder never really got a handle on in coming over to the US and making films. He was still his French persona and is still his same style, whereas Perez just dove right in, creating a character called Bungles that didn't work. Then he dropped out of it and came up with something else. But he was innovating right out of the gate, and really his understanding of the storytelling language of silent film and what you could do with it is really remarkable, going from looking at the films he made in Italy and then watching even the earliest of the things of his from the US made at Eagle that do survive. He was just such an inventive comedy filmmaker, and A Busy Night is a wonderful example of it. It's too bad he never went back and tried something similar again, but it's just so much fun to watch.
Thanks, Ben. To see the inventiveness of Marcel Perez and the film restoration magic of Ben Model, let's screen A Busy Night, courtesy of Undercrank Productions and the Library of Congress. A Busy Night is a wonderful little comedy, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I'd like to quickly ask Steve Massa just one more question. What ultimately happened, Steve, to the Eagle Film Company after its doors closed here in Jacksonville?
The Eagle Film Company, it's a little vague from the trades. It seems like their last films were made in December of 1916. But by spring of 1970s, there are items in the trade saying that they've gone into bankruptcy, and they offered, Eagle Film City was put up on the market. That was an asset, so that could be purchased. And there were 4 Tweedledum films that had never been released that were being offered as well. Along those lines, it's interesting because there was a company in Chicago called Wholesome Films, and they were putting things out in 1917. And one of the films they put out, and it's in their exhibitor ads, is something called His Awful Downfall. And there's Rex Adams as Duffy. And it's a pose, he's got the uniform and he's doing this thing like he does, you see it in the stills. So it looks like this Wholesome Film Company, which was based in Chicago, as because that's where Eagle came from. So it looks like they may have bought at least one or maybe some of the Adventures of Duffy films and actually put them out. So His Awful Downfall may be the only actual release of the Adventures of Duffy. So what happened, I think people did pick up some of the films because there were a couple of Perez films that came out through a distribution company called Unicorn, and listed are some of the Eagle players. So I think they may have picked up some of those. But really what happened after the studio closed was, for a couple of years, nothing. The plant just kind of sit there until Norman purchased it in 1920. He purchased it, and then he started making his films. So really, as an entity, Eagle wasn't around very long. I mean, it was really maybe a year and a half at the most. I mean, I think they had great plans. They had grandiose plans, but I think, they may have spent too much too soon right up front without, the having product to come out and have money coming in. I think, they just, they spent too much on setting up Eagle Film City. But it worked out for Norman Films because they had that great facility.
Although the Eagle Film Company is no longer in existence, the Jacksonville studio it built still stands, and it looks very much as it did more than 100 years ago. Today, Eagle Film City is known as the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum, named after Richard Norman, who acquired the property in the early 1920s. It was there he produced feature-length race films, one of which, The Flying Ace, is on the Library of Congress National Film Registry. Okay, the clock on the wall is really ticking now, but I need to just briefly cover a few more things. As a reminder, the Perez comedies screened during this virtual event are available on 2 Marcel Perez DVDs distributed by Undercrank Productions, along with other shorts the comedian made before and after his time in Jacksonville. Also, if you'd like to find out about other silent films available through Undercrank, simply go to its website at undercrankproductions.com. Oh, and just in case you didn't know, Ben and Steve host something called the Silent Comedy Watch Party every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a great program for anyone who's interested in silent motion picture comedy. And if you miss one of their live streams, no problem. You can watch past episodes on YouTube simply by searching, you guessed it, Silent Comedy Watch Party. Now it is time to wrap up this edition of Early Filmmaking in Jacksonville, Florida. On behalf of the Niles SNA and Norman Studios Silent Film Museums, I'd like to thank Steve Massa for sharing his extensive knowledge of classic film comedy, along with our friend Ben Modell for explaining what was involved in locating and restoring incredibly rare silent films like those of Marcel Perez. And again, a big thank you to Undercrank Productions, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Library of Congress for sharing those two rare Marcel Perez comedies made at Eagle Film City. Oh, and another shout out to Jacksonville historian Wayne Wood for his help in tracking down a number of those long lost Some Hero locations. Finally, if you'd like more information about the Niles S&A or Norman Studios Silent Film Museums, just go to the websites on your screen. Your financial support is very much needed and very much appreciated. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.